Hello, I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University in New York, and let me welcome you to Road to the White House. It is April 20th, the morning after the New York primary, and certainly Mr. Trump and Secretary Clinton have reason to be celebrating. As I said in a press advisory that I did earlier, there's nothing like home cooking, and in this particular case, both did quite well. And I would say both actually exceeded expectations in the New York primary. So let's begin first with the Republicans. As of now, Mr. Trump has picked up 89 of 95 possible delegates. John Kasich has received one, and there's one congressional district where it's too close to, they have to complete the count before we know the thing. But 89, so remember the last lecture where I talked about the mathematics of how Mr. Trump gets to his 1237. Now he is able to add 89, and I would argue this clearly indicates that, to me at least, again I think I'm in a minority, but I think it clearly indicates that he'll have a first ballot victory. He'll have enough delegates. If he doesn't secure them by the time the primaries are over, he'll do so in the between then and the convention. But let's look for a minute about exit polls. These exit polls were conducted by the Edison Research Company and done for the Associated Press and the television networks. So in terms of Republicans, Donald Trump dominated every category. The only category that he didn't was those who opposed the temporary banning of foreign Muslims from entering the United States. He lost that category to Kasich, who opposes that. Everything else, in terms of energizing the party, divided the party, he carries each of those groups. He carries groups of voters who feel government spending is important, carries them. Terrorism, he carries them. Economy, jobs, he carries them. This is in terms of comparison with Kasich and Cruz. Male and female, 59% of the male voters in the Republican primary, according to the exit polls, vote for Trump. 56% of the female voters voted for Trump. Age, same thing, just down the line. So it's an overwhelming victory for Mr. Trump, and as he indicated in his speech last night, there's nothing better than to be recognized by the voters in the state that know him best. Now, shift for a minute to the Democratic side, the Clinton and Sanders totals. Here you have a significant win for Secretary Clinton. She exceeded expectations, 15% plus victory. However, in terms of the impact on the delegates, it's very interesting. She, at this point, has 135 out of the 247, and Sanders has 104 delegates, which is a net gain of 31 for her, and there are 9 contest congressional districts yet to be decided. So she could pick up end up with a net gain of as much as 40 over Senator Sanders. Clearly, major defeat for Sanders. The Sanders campaign in any way that they want, but given the size of turnouts at his rallies, especially in the city here, I think the expectation was that he would narrow that gap, and instead the gap widened as he campaigned. So Clinton built on her base here, built on her very strong support by various party leaders. If you have an opportunity, go to C-SPAN and watch the first 8 or 10 minutes of her acceptance of the rally, and I would call it a rally that was held as she accepted the acclamation and the victory last night. You'll notice that every major New York establishment political leader, from the governor to the mayor to former Mayor Dinkins, all were part of this process. And if you watch at the stage at the end, you'll see a collection of all the major political influentials from New York State. So it was an uphill battle for Sanders. He failed to make much progress. We'll start talking in just a minute about the impact of this. But let's talk for a minute about the exit polls for the Democrats. Here, very interestingly, 52% of the males who voted voted for Sanders, and 61% of the females who voted for Clinton. So there's a gender gap on the Democratic side. There's also something else that's really interesting, and that is males made up approximately 41%, only 41% of the voters, and 59% of the voters were female. So it's obviously a ratio that Senator Clinton hopes to continue in the fall contest. Age-wise, she carries every age group except for those under 29, which she lost by 2-1 to Sanders, which again is consistent, where the Sanders and Feel the Burn movement clearly resonates with younger voters. And one of the challenges the Clinton campaign will have and the Democrats will have going forward, assuming that Clinton ends up with the nomination, is how they keep those voters with her. If you look down race and ethnicity, the only group she lost were white voters. Sanders picked up 51% of white voters, who made up 60% of the total electorate. Union households voted overwhelmingly 57 to 43 for Mrs. Clinton, as indicating her strong support among unions within New York State. When you look at region, New York City, she carried by 62%, Long Island by 52%, Hudson Valley by 52%, urban upstate, that would be Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, she carried, Albany also, she carried by 51%. In rural upstate, she lost 57% to 43%. It appears that the Democratic voters are prepared to support the Sanders voters by about 60%, 65 to 70% said they would vote for the Democratic nominee even if it were not Sanders in the fall. A slightly lower total on the Republican side. Have a very interesting map. My apologies to those of you who are not from New York, but this is a map that WNYC put out this morning. And this shows you, this is the city. This shows you the Democratic primary. Okay, this would be Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens area, Brooklyn area, and Staten Island. If you notice this two color codes where Sanders won by at least 2-1, and notice, okay, even on Staten Island, he was not able to win by 2-1. Look at the darker shades here, Midtown and Upper West Side of where Clinton gets 70% of the vote. In the Bronx, a very heavy concentration of rallies and that by Sanders didn't result in anything. This part of Springfield Gardens and so forth, same. Look at the strong support. Look at the absence of much support for Sanders throughout the city. So this is the reason why, as I mentioned, about 65% of the vote in the city Democratic primary went to Mrs. Clinton. I have a similar map and I'd like to thank WNYC for publishing this so early. Here's a similar map for the Republican primary, and you notice that Kasich only did well in this portion of the east side, and did a little better up here, portion near the park, Central Park. This is Central Park, the gray area is Central Park, on the east side of Central Park. But notice the strong Trump support outside of Manhattan, okay, in the boroughs, again, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, where he gets a majority in the bulk of these neighborhoods, okay. Cruz led only on the far side of Long Island, far out on Long Island, on the east end of Long Island, and in the Borough Park area, okay, where he garnered 57% of the vote, but relatively small numbers of votes if you look here. So I would say that this clearly indicates the overwhelming victory that the Trump campaign had, and I think let's talk for a minute then about what the implications are for the Democrats. Clearly, it breaks Sanders' string of victories. It puts momentum clearly in the hands of Mrs. Clinton. As she mentioned in her speech last night, her argument was we were in the home stretch. She mentioned the fact that she had a ice cream concoction prepared by a small businessman called Victory, and for one of the few times she ate something while she was being taped. So again, there was a feeling in that campaign, in her announcement speech last night, that she was really again trying to pivot towards the national campaign. She also offered an olive branch out to the Sanders campaign, arguing that there were more things that brought them together than divided them. It remains to be seen what the Sanders strategy will be going forward. Last night on an important interview, Jeff Weaver, his campaign manager, indicated that Sanders would go all the way to the convention and contest it on the floor of the convention. So do the math. Remember, I gave you the basis for that math. You have to add the Clinton votes of 135, maybe as many as 144 to the totals. Again, you'll see, unless Sanders drops out, she will not be able to get to her majority without having superdelegate support. And this is going to could be the basis for some contention at the Democratic convention. We swing now ahead to the 5 contests next week on the 26th: Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Large number of delegates at stake here. However, the way Pennsylvania does their delegate allocation process, it is difficult on both the Republican and Democratic side to claim delegates out of that because they run as uncommitted delegates. That doesn't mean that they can't become committed at some point, but it means right now they're uncommitted. So that particular contest, those contests are important, and I'm sure people are already looking ahead. The argument is now that for Ted Cruz, his next and perhaps his last opportunity to stop Trump is in the state of Indiana. And it's interesting, for the Republicans, Indiana has the second largest number of delegates available between now and California. Okay, first, that's the largest number to California, but the second largest available during the rest of the process. So Indiana is going to be pivotal for the Republicans. Trump is already out there at a rally in Indianapolis. Cruz has been there. I'm sure will be back. So that could be a very interesting state. Normally it isn't, again, because of the timing, but this time it's important. And for Sanders' campaign, Indiana becomes important also because it may be a state that he can bounce back. The expectation is he will not do very well next week, the week of the 26th, because these states are very similar to New York or have some characteristics. Although he may run well in parts of Maryland, may run well in parts of Connecticut, remains to be seen what happens. So the last thing that I want to mention about the New York results is that while they don't definitively close off other candidates, it makes it exceedingly more difficult for those candidates to end up the nominee. Trump will go in either with enough votes or very close to enough votes, very difficult to be stopped. Clinton will go in with a majority with the superdelegates. So she has a first ballot victory virtually assured unless there's something develops, perhaps the FBI report or something else, that undercuts her. Other than that, she's on track. She will be the Democratic nominee. Trump is on track, probably 80-20 that he's going to be the Republican nominee. If I said Clinton's going to be the Republican nominee, I meant she's going to be the Democratic nominee in this speak. Okay, now the other point that's important, though, is if you recall, at one point in a prior lecture, I talked about both Clinton and Trump having very high unfavorables. Trump at 43%, Clinton in the high 20s. What does this mean? Well, what it means is that the political process and how we nominate our candidates, it looks as if both parties are going to nominate the least popular candidate that they have. And what does this mean for the American public going forward? I mean, if the American public really wants change, and they don't see, given the unfavorable ratings on these candidates, they don't see these candidates as necessarily offering hope and so forth. What does that mean? And what does it mean about the process? And what does it mean about, the political establishment in the United States? Finally, There has to be some soul searching among conservative Republicans. They had said that if Trump were to receive the nomination, that they would run a third-party candidate. Are they going to do that or not? We don't know. We have to wait and see. And what the impact of that might be, we don't know either. So again, a lot of things remain unresolved at this point. But New York did clarify the fact that Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton, remains very popular in New York. It's a decisive win, and that Trump remains very popular in New York. Decisive win for him. So we go forward from here, kind of, I would say, knowing what's likely to happen, but one never knows when something could change that. But for now, it looks like it will be Clinton and Trump in the fall election. Thank you.